People often imagine that betrayal becomes real at the moment you catch it. I don't think that's true anymore. By the time truth finally appears in a form you can't politely reinterpret, the betrayal has usually been real for a long time. What changes in that moment is not the liar's behavior. What changes is your relationship to your own doubt. And if you are a quiet person, a disciplined person, someone more inclined to observe than erupt, that shift matters more than most people understand. Because once you stop spending energy arguing with what you already know, silence becomes something different. It stops being confusion. It stops being pain without direction. It becomes leverage. I learned that the hard way in my own house, through a security camera I had installed for reasons so ordinary they now feel almost insulting. Not because I was suspicious. Not because I was tracking anyone. Because we had package thefts in the neighborhood. And because my husband, Ethan, had once laughed and said, "You always think about the practical thing before the emotional one." At the time, I took that as one of those mildly affectionate observations couples collect over the years. Later, I understood that he had been making a larger judgment about me for a long time. He thought practicality made me slow. He thought patience made me passive. He thought my self-control meant that even if I ever saw the truth clearly, I would still need time to become dangerous. That was his mistake. My name is Daniel Ward. I'm 45 years old, and until a little over a year ago, I had been married for 14 years to a man named Ethan. We lived outside Seattle in a neighborhood full of cedar fences, rain-dark sidewalks, and houses that all seemed designed to communicate tasteful emotional stability to people driving by too quickly to see what was actually happening inside. We had no children, though we had spent years talking in circles about whether we wanted them, which is one of those conversations couples think they are postponing when, in reality, they are often revealing something essential about how differently they imagine the future. I worked in procurement strategy for a healthcare equipment group. My days were built around contracts, forecasting, vendor behavior, budget timing, and all the slow, disciplined forms of attention that keep other people's bad assumptions from turning into expensive emergencies. Ethan worked in media partnerships for a regional lifestyle publisher. He was charming, socially fluid, verbally fast, and very good at creating momentum around himself. If I was the kind of man who trusted structure, Ethan was the kind who trusted atmosphere. That contrast attracted me at first. I think it often does. Quiet men are easily seduced by brightness when brightness still feels sincere. Ethan knew how to enter a room and make it seem as though the room had improved in response. He was funny without looking like he was trying. Flirtatious in the socially harmless way handsome men often are when they want to be admired without immediate consequence, and emotionally expressive in ways I was not. In the early years, I thought that meant he was more alive than I was. Later, I understood that some people are not more alive. They are simply more dependent on being witnessed. To be fair, our marriage was not a hollow performance from the beginning. There had been real tenderness. Real care too. We survived layoffs, a cross-state move, my father's decline after a stroke, his mother's prolonged battles with alcohol and debt, and one brutal year when my work became so consuming that I started measuring time only by quarter-end deadlines and airline receipts. We had routines, private jokes, favorite restaurants, a vacation tradition on the Oregon coast, and the sort of small domestic vocabulary long relationships build when love becomes less cinematic and more load-bearing. That matters to me. I resist the temptation to rewrite everything as fraud because that kind of revision always serves pride more than truth. Still, if I am going to tell this honestly, I need to criticize myself before I criticize him. I spent too many years believing steadiness would naturally be recognized as value. I thought if I paid attention, kept promises, handled the practical burdens of our life without complaint, and avoided the sort of emotional theater that exhausts everyone around it, then the person beside me would understand what kind of ground he was standing on. That was naive. Quiet stability gets adapted to very quickly. Once someone decides it is permanent, they stop admiring it and start spending against it. Ethan had little ways of describing me that should have concerned me sooner than they did. In public, he called me grounded, which sounded flattering. In private, depending on the mood, I became predictable, over-careful, too procedural, too quick to ask practical questions when a little faith was apparently the more loving response. None of those phrases are overtly cruel. That is part of what makes them dangerous. They slowly convert your virtues into traits the other person can cast as limiting without ever sounding monstrous for doing it. The first real shift in the marriage was not an affair. It was asymmetry. Ethan's needs became layered, contextual, nuanced. My concerns became blunt, excessive, or somehow emotionally unsophisticated. If I noticed distance, I was reading too much into normal stress. If I questioned a story that did not fully add up, I was making us both live inside unnecessary scrutiny. If I pointed out that our schedules no longer seemed to overlap by accident but by design, he would laugh and tell me I sounded like a detective in a bad streaming drama. That last line stayed with me because, like many manipulative jokes, it was doing more work than humor admits. He was telling me how I should hear myself before I got too close to hearing him clearly. There was also a man, of course. His name was Gavin. He worked in event production and had crossed paths with Ethan through sponsored nightlife launches, restaurant features, and one of those endlessly social professional ecosystems where everyone is always either collaborating or pretending not to be flirting. I met him twice. He was the sort of man who understands the value of looking casually expensive. Clean beard, expensive sneakers, voice lowered half a register below natural to imply calm he probably did not possess. Ethan described him in that very modern way people use when they want to make inappropriate interest sound like mere aesthetic commentary. Gavin was chaotic but entertaining. Gavin understood people instantly. Gavin was hopelessly unserious, which is probably why everyone likes him. The framing was important. Too dismissive to be neutral. Too textured to be irrelevant. I noticed. That's the part one need to say plainly. I noticed long before I admitted meaning. There were late nights that accumulated beyond plausibility. A phone suddenly given its own weather system. Never hidden in a childish way, just carried everywhere, angled differently, checked with a softness in his face that disappeared too quickly when I entered the room. There were stories that came with too much context, which is one of the oldest signs that context is being used as camouflage. Real life usually arrives messily. Lies arrive with advanced packaging. But I did what conscientious people often do. I translated my discomfort downward in the name of fairness. I didn't want to become a suspicious husband inventing ugliness because another man's name had started surfacing too often. I also had another bias working against me. I believed that because Ethan knew me as well as he did, he would not push past a certain line of disrespect. That was not just trust. It was vanity. I thought our history made certain forms of betrayal too crude for him. What I had not yet understood was that contempt lowers the threshold for what people imagine they can do safely. The camera that caught him was mounted over the side entrance off the mudroom. Again, not because I was suspicious. Months earlier, we had 2 packages disappear from the porch, and I had installed a modest home security setup. Front entrance, driveway, side gate, and the mudroom entry that led from the detached garage passage. Ethan rolled his eyes at the time and said I had the soul of an insurance adjuster, which was not entirely wrong. Then he forgot about the cameras because practical things tend to become invisible to people who do not personally maintain them. The day everything changed was a Wednesday in early March. I was supposed to be in Portland for an overnight vendor meeting, but the meeting was shortened after a contract issue got resolved by phone instead of in person. I landed back in Seattle earlier than planned, drove straight to the office, and worked until nearly 7 before heading home. Ethan thought I was still out of town. I know that because he texted me at 6:12 p.m. "How's Portland? Eat something decent for once." The carelessness of that message still interests me. Not because it was malicious. Because it revealed how separate his active narrative had become from the shared reality of our marriage. He wasn't checking on me. He was tending the story. When I got home, the house was dark. His car was gone. I showered, made myself tea, and sat down in the den with my laptop intending to answer a few emails before bed. Somewhere around 8:30, I remembered a package due that day and opened the camera app to see whether it had been delivered. It had. Then I clicked back through the afternoon feed for the side entrance because that was where larger packages were sometimes left if the driver thought it more protected from weather. At 3:47 p.m., Ethan entered through the side gate. At 3:48 p.m., Gavin followed him. They did not come through the front. They did not behave like men meeting casually by chance. Ethan looked around once, quickly, automatically, and then touched Gavin at the lower back as he led him inside. That detail mattered more than the rest. People imagine that discovery arrives like a hammer. Sometimes it does. For me, it arrived like a sentence finally completing itself. Not shock exactly. Recognition. The body still reacts, of course. Heat in the face. Tightness in the throat. The momentary surrealism of seeing your own home become evidence. But underneath that was something cleaner. The argument with myself ended instantly. No more interpretive negotiations. No more dignified overcorrections. No more trying to prove to myself that I was mature enough not to think the obvious thing. Reality had finally become more disrespectful than denial. I could have confronted him right then. That is what many people imagine strength requires. March into the room. Force confession. Demand the theater of truth. But I had already spent too many years around contracts, internal reviews, and institutional self-protection not to know what early confrontation often does. It hands narrative control back to the liar. The moment I exploded, the issue would cease to be the structure and become the scene. Ethan would cry, deny scale, admit fragments, accuse me of surveillance, insist I was misunderstanding context, or shift into the sort of morally sophisticated language expressive people use when they want bad behavior to sound emotionally nuanced. No. I watched the rest of the footage. They stayed nearly 2 hours. At 5:31 p.m., Gavin left through the same side gate, jacket zipped, face neutral, walking not like a guest but like a man accustomed to invisible exits. Ethan remained inside another 20 minutes before leaving in his own car. I later realized he was probably going out briefly so he could return home with the energy of a normal evening rather than the atmosphere of someone who had just betrayed his husband in the house he helped pay for. I sat there in the dark for a long time after the footage ended. This is the part that matters most. I did not stay silent because I was afraid. I stayed silent because in that moment I understood something Ethan did not. The affair itself was no longer the only truth available to me. What the camera had captured was not just cheating. It was method, private entry, managed timing, familiarity. The house being used as if my absence were a fixed resource. And behind all of that was a larger truth, that Ethan had grown confident enough in his reading of me to assume he still had time. That was my advantage. The next morning, I went to work as usual. I did not call him. I did not leave notes. I did not send myself into melodrama in the parking lot. I began, instead, doing what my entire adult life had trained me to do once denial was no longer useful. I collected structure. I downloaded the footage. I reviewed our account activity more closely than I had in months. Parking charges, restaurant bills, hotel bar tabs, rideshare destinations, event dates. Once I stopped protecting his innocence, the pattern clarified itself faster than I would have believed possible. There were other afternoons. Other overlaps. A boutique hotel near the waterfront on 2 dates when Ethan had supposedly been at brand dinners. Cash withdrawals before weekends I had spent visiting my father. Parking at a condo building registered to Gavin's neighborhood. It was all there. Not as a dramatic movie plot. As administration. That matters because adult betrayal usually survives through logistics, not passion. I also met with an attorney before I said anything. A man named Samuel Green. Late 50s, dry, efficient, uninterested in emotional spectacle. He asked exactly the questions I needed asked. Property, accounts, timing, exposure, what evidence existed, whether Ethan knew I knew. Samuel told me something that settled my thinking more than any comforting phrase could have. The spouse who thinks he still owns the timeline almost always gives away more than the spouse who has accepted the facts. That sentence explained my silence perfectly. Over the following 3 weeks, I changed as little as possible externally and everything internally. I stopped volunteering warmth where it was no longer truthful. I remained civil, functional, available for ordinary conversation. I did not start fights. I did not check his phone. I did not sleep in the guest room. I let him continue inhabiting the assumption that I was still in the old marriage while I quietly prepared to leave the actual one. He noticed some difference, of course, but interpreted it exactly as I expected he would. One evening he stood in the kitchen while I was rinsing dishes and said, "You've been weirdly quiet lately." I looked at him and said, "I've been tired." That was true, but not in the way he heard it. He smiled, came up behind me, and kissed my shoulder with the practiced softness of a man maintaining emotional infrastructure he still needed. "You work too much," he said. Again, what interested me was not the lie itself. It was the management. He was still tending the version of me he needed to exist. The calm husband. The practical husband. The one too responsible to destabilize the household without complete certainty. He did not understand that certainty had already happened and that silence, by then, was no longer indecision. It was timing. The turning point came on a Friday night. Ethan had told me he was attending a media dinner and would be home late. I had already seen, through account timing and one carelessly stored email, that he and Gavin had a room booked downtown. By then, I no longer needed more evidence. I needed conclusion. So while he was gone, I packed what mattered, moved key documents into my car, transferred the remainder of my personal reserves, and left the divorce filing packet on my office desk to be finalized Monday morning. Then I sat in the den and waited for him to come home. He walked in a little after 11 with the exact expression I had come to recognize as dangerous long before I named it. The expression of a man who thinks his evening has remained invisible. "Hey," he said. "You're still up." I was waiting. That changed his face immediately. Not because he knew yet, but because tone matters. There are tones you only hear when the old agreement has ended and you were not told when. I asked him to sit down. He tried a smile. "That sounds serious." "It is." Then I turned my laptop toward him and played the clip from the side camera. No speeches. No build-up. No accusations. Just the footage. I watched him watch himself. That is one of the strangest experiences of my life. Not because it was satisfying, but because it stripped the room of language. He had lived for weeks, maybe months, in emotional control of the timeline. In less than a minute, the timeline stopped belonging to him. What mattered was not that I had caught him. What mattered was that I had already stopped needing his explanation. When the clip ended, he exhaled once, looked away, and said, "I can explain." Of course he said that. It is the most human line in the world and one of the least useful. I said, "That's the first thing I know you can't do." Then he started. Loneliness. Drift. Emotional distance. Feeling unseen. Gavin understanding a part of him. He had stopped being able to access at home. The usual architecture. I listened because listening no longer endangered me. The danger had existed only while I still needed his language to guide my interpretation. That need was gone. Then I told him I had already downloaded the footage, reviewed the financials, spoken to an attorney, and prepared the filing. That was the real turning point. Not the camera. Not the affair. The fact that while he thought I was quietly absorbing life in the old way, I had already moved beyond the need to be managed by his version of it. He had mistaken my silence for passivity. In reality, silence had become the space in which I stopped negotiating with what I knew. He said, almost helplessly, "Why didn't you say something when you found out?" That question has stayed with me because it reveals so much. He was not asking morally. He was asking strategically. Why didn't I intervene sooner while intervention might still have allowed him to reassert emotional control? Because, I said, the moment I spoke, you would have tried to turn this into your conversation. I needed it to stay reality. That was the cleanest answer I had. The divorce itself was not loud. Painful, yes. Administrative, mostly. We had no children to protect from the details, which in some ways made it easier and in some ways made the emptiness harder. Friends learned in stages. Some were surprised. Others less so. Gavin disappeared from relevance almost immediately once the structure of the affair was forced into daylight. That also taught me something. Third parties often matter less than betrayed people initially think. They are frequently just mirrors held up to weakness already growing inside the marriage. A year later, Ethan asked to meet for coffee because some final paperwork issue required signatures and because, I suspect, he still needed one more conversation in which he could hear himself narrate what happened as something more tragic and mutual than it was. At one point he said, "You really just sat on that knowledge." I looked at him and said, "No. I sat still while you kept proving it. That, in the end, is the lesson." Silence was my advantage not because it made me clever, but because it denied him early access to my pain. It prevented him from using my first hurt reaction as the stage on which to rebuild innocence. It let the truth grow complete enough that by the time I acted, I was no longer acting from humiliation. I was acting from fact. If there is anything worth carrying from my story beyond the obvious sadness of it, it is this. Silence is not always weakness, and it is not always virtue. Sometimes it is fear. Sometimes it is exhaustion. But when used deliberately, silence can become the only space in which reality is allowed to assemble itself without interruption from the person most invested in reshaping it. That is what mine became. The camera caught the affair. Waiting showed me the structure behind it. And once I saw that structure clearly, I no longer needed noise to prove I understood it.